Hi BookTube, it's Amy. So I'm here for my Friday reads. It was snowing a little bit this morning, so it's not a nice spring weekend. It's feeling a bit more like a bit of a winter weekend. It's not too cold, but it was cold enough for it to snow. I got lucky. We just had flurries in my neighborhood, but I guess out in Canada and further north in Sudbury, they actually had a significant amount of snow on the ground. Not something I want to see in early to mid-May. So it'll definitely be, as if I had a choice, it'll be another weekend sitting indoors reading. Although they have here in the city of Ottawa lifted some of the restrictions they had on public green spaces. So as per provincial restrictions, parks are still closed. You're not allowed to sit on benches or, as if I was going to anyway, play on playground equipment. Kids aren't allowed on the playground equipment, adults neither. You're not allowed on tennis courts or sports fields, but the city of Ottawa has lifted one of their sort of additional restrictions about stopping in green spaces. So before it was walk through only, but now they say you're allowed to sit on the grass or have a picnic with your family, as long as you're not more than 5 people and you're respecting distance between you and other people using the green space. But that's nice because once it finally warms up a bit again, I would like to go down to the park and sit on the grass with a book. You know, it's not much, but not being able to do that has sort of discouraged me from taking as many walks because I felt a bit like I was walking sort of aimlessly, going nowhere. And I realized, although I've always loved taking walks, one of the pleasures of taking walks was walking with a destination in mind, walking to a park, walking to a garden, walking somewhere where when I got there I would sit for a moment and perhaps read a book, perhaps stop into a pub or a coffee shop, and then turn around and come home. But lately, it's not much fun walking to nowhere, walking knowing that you can't even sit down on a park bench. So the park benches are still off bounds, but I can sit in the grass. But unfortunately, we have a really crummy weekend for it. It's been absolutely gray, although it was quite exciting last night. The Snowbirds, which are Canada's aerial, I don't know what to call them, a group of fighter jets that do aerial shows and whatnot. They usually fly over Canada Day, but at this moment they are in the progress of flying from coast to coast to coast here in Canada. I'm not sure how far north they're going to go, but they started out in Nova Scotia last weekend, and Nova Scotia has experienced several horrible tragedies recently, between the mass shooting and the loss of a number of members from the military in a helicopter accident off the coast of Greece. And then, of course, you've got the pandemic on top of that. So they did start in Nova Scotia, and they worked their way yesterday up to Ottawa, Gatineau. They flew over Montreal first and then came down into Gatineau and Ottawa. And they flew overhead here about 10 to 5 o'clock. I saw them go by and they made a loop and disappeared in the distance. And then they came back and they actually flew right overhead, although they were certainly a lot higher than, say for instance, on Canada Day. On Canada Day, when they flew overhead, they usually do a flyover Parliament on Canada Day. And so everything just rumbles in the flight path, but it was actually significantly quieter than I thought. So even though they were flying nearby, they were kilometers and kilometers away, I suppose, because it really wasn't that loud, but that was, I don't know, inspiring, comforting to see. And people were out on their balconies, kids and whatnot, sort of cheering, and people just looking up to watch. and they are continuing today across Eastern Ontario, and they are releasing their flight path as they go, their flyover times. But I think it's quite an interesting thing to do at a time like this. I think you'd certainly want to know they're coming, because it is quite jarring if you don't know they're about to fly over. I recall the first Canada Day that the Snowbirds flew over. I was in downtown Ottawa. It was Canada 150, and just packed into this crowd of people. All of a sudden, this massive roar, and my friend said to me, "Oh, it's the Snowbirds," but it was absolutely deafening, and it startled me because I didn't know they were coming. There was actually a Beaverton article. If you've never heard of the Beaverton, it's a satirical news site here in Canada, and there was a headline about Canadian Air Force plans to terrify citizens with warplanes. So it's both inspiring, but I think you need to know they're coming so you don't get absolutely startled by, this deafening formation of red and white jets going overhead. All that aside, though, I saw the Snowbirds, I saw the snow. I wanted to see the Snowbirds. I did not want to see the snow, but I did read some books here. We're 6 minutes in, and I'm just getting to the books. Maybe I should start over, but I don't think I will. I hope that you're enjoying this Friday morning ramble. A Book Hunter's Holiday. I read A Book Hunter's Holiday earlier this week. This showed up in my mailbox on Monday, and this is a collection of essays about books and about book collecting that was published by A.S.W. Rosenbach in 1929 originally, and I have a 1936 printing here. And Rosenbach was known as a famous book collector, but I believe he also dabbled with trading in books as well. And so this is a collection of essays that he wrote about his own adventures in collecting, and there's also a few in here just about book collectors in general. So we start off with a chapter called Letters That We Ought to Burn, where he talks about love letters. And I guess for quite a while, love letters were kind of off limits when you were writing biographies. They were considered far too private to be included in biographical works. But Rosenbach definitely took an interest in reading those love letters and in acquiring those love letters for his collection. And so he talks about famous people here, famous authors, and discusses this sort of dilemma. If something was meant to be private, if someone had asked for their love letters to be burnt upon their death, and the owner of their estate didn't do it and instead published them, is that ethical? But it's a very interesting essay. And then we have him talking about old mystery books, about murder in novels, about women book hunters, about newspapers. There's a very interesting chapter in here on almanacs. I guess almanacs were one of the most popular things in print in early North America. In addition to Bibles and Psalms and that sort of thing. And a lot of people had them in their pocket. It might have been the only book that they owned because it served as a calendar of sorts. You could have it in your pocket, you could pull it out and find out, there's a holiday today. But as well, there was interesting predictions about what that day would be like. There's an interesting chapter in here about libraries of presidents of the United States, and I hadn't realized that when the British burned Washington and the White House during the War of 1812, they did in fact burn the archives as well. But before you get too outraged, I mean, it's a horrible thing, but Washington was burned in retaliation for York, that's modern day Toronto, which the Americans came and burned first, also destroying a significant portion of Canada's archives. It's a good thing that our two countries are kinder to our collections of books today. But I guess after that all happened, another American president, I believe it was, oh goodness, I'm not remembering, Jefferson. Jefferson donated a significant portion of his library to replace the burned archives, and the American government purchased his collection for a reduced price. It went on to form a new government archive, and then about 2/3 of it was destroyed in another fire a few years later. So definitely a precarious beginning to the United States library and archives. And then Christmas, there was a chapter in here on Christmas books. And I did not know this, but in early Americana, there were not many publications or books about Christmas, which seems a little odd because, you know, America is one of the countries that is really big on Christmas these days, and it's a massive affair. But I guess in the early days, a lot of the people moving to America were sort of fleeing that very authoritative church in Europe. And so many of them sort of left those Christmas traditions behind, and in one particular colony, I guess it was actually against the law to celebrate Christmas for a short period of time. But of course, Christmas did eventually make a comeback, and it became quite the holiday. But I was quite interested to learn that Christmas wasn't always a big affair in the United States. So I read this, greatly enjoyed that. And then on a similar theme, I started reading another book that arrived on Monday, Holbrook Jackson's The Anatomy of Bibliomania. And this one is a little bit slower going because it's quite dense, intricate writing. And it is a sort of, I think he actually describes it as a treatise on books. It's sort of a love letter so far to books. So I read just a little bit in, and there is a section on book reverence, the praise of books, a catalog of fond similitudes of books and their most excellent qualities. And what he's doing so far is pulling various quotations that people have used to describe books into a essay of sorts. And so this is a book that indicates a great level of knowledge, a vast appetite for reading about books and book lovers, and what probably amounts to years of extensive research. And it's wonderful so far. I will actually maybe pull this out later today to read you a page or two, because it's absolutely this intricate, rich writing. And of course, with all these quotations and all these references to book lovers, there are potentially hundreds or thousands of rabbit holes for me to follow. And I am probably going to spend a good chunk of the weekend reading this one. And then yesterday I read this slim little volume that arrived in the mail, Guy de Maupassant's Femme Fatale, and I realized even despite its size, there are actually more than one short story in here. And I quite like Maupassant's writing style, just based on these short stories. This, I think, is the first I've read of his short stories, but he seems to be the sort of writer that tells a good little snippet of a story and then ends with a bit of a bang or a I don't know how to describe it, a snap, if you want to call it that, a little shock factor. The first story in this collection is called Cockcrow, and it's about this wealthy man who's been trying to seduce this married woman, and he works really, really hard at it, and she is eventually ready to give in, and after this long day of hunting, She invites him to her bedchambers and she tells him to lie down in the bed. She disappears for a minute. I can only assume to get ready in the bathroom or take off her robe or something. And he falls asleep, and they never consummate their love affair at all that night. Instead, he wakes up and she speaks to him as she would to her husband, to someone who is, an old love who doesn't excite her anymore. And he was building up this whole love affair this whole night. It was going to be like the best night of his life, and he fell asleep. And then we follow that up with the title story here, Femme Fatale, which was immensely interesting to me. So we have this young man, Paul, and he is quite enamored with this young woman. They are seen boating together, walking together, having coffee and tea together at this boatside cafe. But it's revealed that this boatside cafe / club is perhaps a bit of I don't want to call it a seedy underbelly, although that's perhaps how Maupassant or people of the era would have put it, but it's a place where people who don't fit into the conventions of proper society seem to congregate. And so Paul is out in the boat with the woman that he is in love with. He seems to have just met her recently, and they spot two women boating together. Her name is Madeline. I was just checking that for myself. So Paul and Madeline are out boating together. He is head over heels in love with her, and at first it appears that she is in love with him too. But then out in a rowboat, there is a lesbian couple, and people start to cheer out from the shore. They're yelling, "Lesbos, Lesbos," and Paul begins to whistle and sort of harass them from the boat. And Madeline tells him to stop that, to not harass these two women. And Paul sort of threatens her and says, I don't want you to ever speak to those women, don't associate with them. He seems to have a deep-seated fear. And then we find out that one of the women's name is in fact Pauline, and that Madeline has a relationship of some sort with Pauline. Paul eventually realizes that Madeline has snuck off to make love to Pauline in the bushes, and in some weird sort of despair, he commits suicide by jumping into the water and drowning himself. And there's a telling line about him, how he would have been able to bear it better if she had been with another man rather than a woman. And I think the two names are interesting, Paul and Pauline. It's almost like she's found a better version of him in a woman. And she doesn't seem to be too fazed, which indicates that she never thought much of him. She is, of course, horrified that he's jumped into the water and drowned himself, but afterwards she goes off with Pauline as though she's picked the better person. It ends with Madeline got up, still sobbing but less violently. She leaned her head on Pauline's shoulder, seeming to find there a safer, warmer refuge and a closer, more intimate affection. She walked slowly away from the scene. So it's this jarring ending where Paul, I guess because he's been rejected by a woman, is so horrified at the fact that she is in love with a woman that he kills himself. And Madeline finds solace in Pauline. And there's a number of other interesting stories like that, including Laid to Rest, where a young man, after the death of his father, finds out that his father had a mistress who he went to see every Thursday. And at first he goes to see this mistress just to convey the fact that his father has died and to offer her the money that his father intended her to get. But slowly it turns into a habit, and soon he's the one going every Thursday to see this woman and to see this young boy who he finds out is his half-brother. So interesting little collection of stories here. And then I also read The first essay in the Oxford World Classics Seneca Dialogues and Essays, it's called Providence, and Seneca tackles the sort of age-old question, I guess for religious people, why do the gods allow bad things to happen to good people? And Seneca gets around this question by saying God does not allow bad things to happen to good people, by presenting us with a very, very narrow definition of what bad is. He defines evil as vices, as drinking too much, as leading to your own ruin. But he says that misfortunes, which are not bad things, misfortunes happen to good people as a way to strengthen them, to test their virtue the way an athlete strengthens their muscles. And so he has some interesting things to say, but he does very much get around the entire issue by providing a very narrow definition of what bad is, of what evil is. He says that bad things never happen to good people because with his definition of virtue, they never interact. Now, of course, I solved the whole problem myself by saying that the question is irrelevant because there is no all-seeing God who is orchestrating events. So the question is irrelevant, but I still did enjoy reading this. So that is what I have been up to. As I said, I do intend to spend most of the weekend sort of neck deep in the anatomy of Bibliomania. And I hope you're all going to have a lovely weekend as well. Do let me know what you've been up to in the comments below, what you've been reading, and whether you've read any of these books that I've mentioned here.